Pacific Ocean, late 1944. The sun is setting over a quiet stretch of sea near the South China coast. The sky burns gold, then fades into a metallic gray. A Japanese reconnaissance plane glides low over the water, its engine humming in steady rhythm. Below, the ocean seems calm, empty, but the pilot's eye catches something strange. A faint wake, a thin silver line cutting through the surface where no ship should be. He circles once, lowering altitude. Nothing. Just waves. Then, a glint of steel beneath the surface, a shadow longer than a destroyer, moving in silence. By the time his radio crackles with the message, the shadow has already vanished, submerged into the deep Pacific. That same week, 4 Japanese freighters disappear without a trace. No witnesses, no survivors, only the silence of the sea. Japan had finally realized that something vast and unseen was hunting them, America's silent fleet. But the discovery had come far too late, because by then the submarines were everywhere, and the Empire's lifeline was already bleeding out beneath the waves. The Empire ascends December 1941. The rising sun stretched from the jungles of Malaya to the coral reefs of the Central Pacific. Within months of Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan had built an empire larger than the Third Reich. The Western Pacific was theirs. Manila, Singapore, Hong Kong, all had fallen. The Imperial Navy ruled the seas, its flagships gleaming with new paint and victory pride. The United States reeled. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor, battleships burning and twisted in the harbor mud. The Japanese had achieved what many believed impossible, complete naval superiority in the Pacific. For a time it seemed unshakable. But beyond the headlines of defeat, deep within American shipyards and naval bases, something quiet was forming. Submarines. Dozens of them, hidden under steel domes, assembled in cold industrial light. The men who would crew them were training, learning a kind of warfare the Japanese neither feared nor fully understood. While Japan expanded outward, towards Australia, Burma, and the Solomon Islands, the United States began to focus inward, on endurance and rebuilding. Roosevelt's words, "We shall gain the inevitable triumph," were no mere rhetoric. Behind them stood the vast machinery of American industry, already shifting toward war. The strategic picture shifts. Japan's empire was an island empire, magnificent but fragile. It survived on oil, rubber, and iron, lifeblood carried across thousands of miles of ocean from conquered territories like the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. Every drop of oil that powered a Zero fighter, every bullet fired from a Japanese rifle, depended on a merchant fleet vulnerable to attack. At first, that vulnerability went unnoticed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for great fleet battles, decisive engagements fought with carriers and battleships. Submarines, in their doctrine, existed only to support these clashes, to weaken the enemy fleet before the main confrontation. They never imagined submarines could become the decisive weapon themselves. The United States saw it differently. Even as wreckage still smoldered at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Ernest King began to redefine the war at sea. They realized that Japan's empire could be strangled, not by confronting its mighty surface fleet head-on, but by cutting its arteries. If the U.S. Navy could sever Japan's maritime supply routes, the empire would collapse from within. The early struggles of the silent service. The idea was simple. The execution was not. In early 1942, American submarines set out into the vast Pacific, small, cramped, and often underarmed. The first patrols were frustrating. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's standard weapon, was disastrously flawed, running too deep, failing to detonate, or sometimes detonating prematurely. Entire missions ended with 0 confirmed kills. Crews risked their lives to fire at targets that simply refused to sink. Reports poured in. Skippers complained. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed them. For months, the failures continued even as men died. Meanwhile, Japan still believed its convoys were safe. Merchant ships steamed without escorts. Tankers sailed unguarded. No radar, no sonar, no zigzag maneuvers. They had yet to realize the invisible war had begun. By mid-1942, the tide of conventional war began to turn, first at Coral Sea, then dramatically at Midway. 4 Japanese carriers were lost, and with them, Japan's strategic initiative. Yet beneath those larger battles, the U.S. submarine force, small but growing, began to strike deeper, farther, and more effectively. The war of attrition begins in the dark corridors of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force headquarters at Pearl Harbor. New tactics were being tested. Instead of hunting enemy warships, the submarines were ordered to attack logistics, oil tankers, freighters, troop transports. The mission was clear: isolate Japan. Each successful patrol was a whisper of vengeance for Pearl Harbor. But it was also the beginning of one of the most ruthless campaigns of the Second World War. One fought not with massed armies or grand invasions, but with patience, silence, and steel beneath the sea. Every sinking was a small victory. Every torpedo that struck true sent ripples through Japan's lifelines. The Empire did not yet know it, but the countdown to isolation had already begun. And as American submarines slipped quietly through the Pacific currents, a transformation was underway, one that would soon change the entire nature of the war. The rebirth of the American fleet by late 1942, the silent service was no longer an experiment. It was becoming the sharpest blade in America's arsenal. The shipyards at Groton, Mare Island, and Portsmouth worked day and night, launching new submarines faster than Japan could replace its lost ships. These new vessels, the Gato class, were built for endurance. Longer range, thicker hulls, improved engines. Each could travel from Pearl Harbor to the South China Sea and back without refueling. They carried 24 torpedoes, enough to sink an entire convoy if skillfully used. And inside, every inch was filled with humming machinery, pressure gauges, and the smell of oil and sweat. The men inside were not ordinary sailors. They lived in a world of red lights and confined steel. Temperatures could rise above 100-degree Fahrenheit. Air grew thick with diesel fumes and tension. Yet they endured, because the submarines gave them something new: initiative. Each submarine was a self-contained hunter, operating independently, often hundreds of miles from command. Their mission: seek, strike, vanish. It was warfare that rewarded nerve, precision, and silence, fixing the fatal flaws. The turning point came not from the sea, but from the laboratories and test ranges of the U.S. Navy. After months of catastrophic failures, officers like Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, forced a full investigation into the Mark 14 torpedo's defects. What they found shocked them: faulty magnetic exploders, depth control errors, and unreliable detonators, all due to bureaucratic denial and lack of wartime testing. Lockwood's famous words echoed across the fleet: "If the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that work, then for God's sake get the Bureau of Ships to design us a bow that will ram ships to death." By mid-1943, the problems were fixed. For the first time, the submarine's bite matched their bark. Every torpedo now carried a promise that no Japanese ship was safe. Intelligence joins the hunt meanwhile. In hidden rooms at Pearl Harbor and Washington, cryptanalysts were quietly breaking Japan's naval codes. Magic, as it was called, provided submarine commanders with information about convoy routes, sailing times, and even the cargo aboard. What had once been a blind hunt now became a calculated ambush. Japanese tankers left Singapore carrying crude oil. American subs waited along the Luzon Strait, their periscopes breaking the surface only for seconds. Convoy signals were intercepted, coordinates confirmed. Then came the silence of the stalk, and the thunder of detonation beneath the waves. Japan's miscalculation. While the Americans adapted, Japan stagnated. Their naval high command believed the submarine's primary duty was to target enemy warships. Merchant raiding was seen as dishonorable, a distraction from the glory of fleet combat. As a result, Japan's own submarines sank few cargo ships, and worse, they failed to defend their own lifelines. Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained primitive. They lacked sonar-equipped escorts, radar detection, and effective depth charges. Convoys were rare and uncoordinated. Most merchantmen sailed alone, trusting in luck and distance, but the Pacific was not empty anymore. By 1943, U.S. submarines prowled from the Solomon Islands to the East China Sea. Their reach extended across Japan's empire. Unseen, patient, deadly. The silent shift of power every successful patrol was reported in brief, clinical words. 3 freighters sunk 21,000 tons, 2 tankers destroyed, heavy explosions. Behind those numbers lay hundreds of lost lives, days of pursuit, and seconds of decision. Submarine commanders, men like Dudley "Mush" Morton of USS Wahoo, Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, and Richard O'Kane of USS Tang, became legends of a war no one could see. They lived by stealth and sudden violence, earning their kills not in open battle but through nerve and precision under pressure. As Japan pushed deeper into the Pacific, the silent fleet followed, cutting deeper into its arteries. Unseen, unstoppable. By 1944, the effect was undeniable. Japanese shipyards couldn't replace losses fast enough. The merchant fleet that once numbered over 6 million tons had already lost nearly half. Factories in Japan began to ration coal. Cities dimmed at night to save power. Still, the Imperial Navy clung to pride and doctrine, unaware that its greatest enemy was not the aircraft carrier, but the submarine. And when Japan finally understood what was happening beneath the waves, the realization came too late to change anything. The hunters were already everywhere, and the Pacific had become their ocean, the technological edge. Building the silent fleet by 1943, American shipyards were turning out submarines faster than any navy in history. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering, compact, lethal, and reliable. The Gato class, soon followed by the Balao and Tench classes, became the silent warriors of the Pacific. Their hulls, reinforced with high-tensile steel, allowed dives below 400 feet, far deeper than Japanese depth charges could reliably reach. Their radar systems, especially the SJ surface search radar, gave them eyes in darkness. They could spot convoys long before being detected. And with improved sonar, they could hear the heartbeats of ships miles away. Inside, however, life was a world apart from the grandeur of battleships. Submariners worked shoulder to shoulder, sleeping between torpedoes or on pipes that throbbed with machinery. The air grew stale within days. Sweat and diesel blended into a constant haze. Yet these men, sealed in steel tubes, became the vanguard of America's counterstrike. Each submarine carried its own personality. Some were haunted by failure, others blessed by uncanny luck. Crews decorated their conning towers with kill marks, silhouettes of ships sunk. The hulls of submarines like USS Wahoo, USS Tang, and USS Barb bore long rows of them, each a story of risk and resolve. Technology had given the U.S. Navy an edge, but it was the men who transformed those machines into predators. The human factor, life in the depths. The men of the silent service were a rare breed, volunteers all. Submarine duty was among the most dangerous assignments of the war. 1 in 5 never returned. When a submarine dove beneath the surface, it entered a world where pressure could crush steel, and silence meant survival. Every sound mattered. A dropped wrench could mean death. A single mistake, a wrong turn of a valve, a missed bearing, could end hundreds of lives. Yet within that tension, camaraderie thrived. Ranks blurred in the confined corridors. Officers and enlisted men shared the same air, the same danger. They were bound by unspoken trust. On patrol, days blurred into weeks. The hum of engines, the creak of hull plates, the distant thump of depth charges, all became part of the rhythm of life. Meals were brief but cherished. Canned fruit was a luxury, coffee a necessity. Letters from home arrived only between missions, often months apart. When the order came, battle stations torpedo. Time seemed to slow. The crew moved with mechanical precision. The captain peered through the periscope, calm amid chaos. Bearings were called, depth adjusted, speed reduced. Then a quiet command, fire one, a hiss, a bubble trail. A few seconds of waiting that felt like eternity. Then the dull, distant roar. The ship shuddered slightly as the torpedo struck its mark. Men held their breath, straining to hear the sounds that followed. Explosions, breaking steel, rushing water. Another ship down. Another lifeline cut. For the men below the surface, victory was never celebrated loudly. There was only relief, and the knowledge that others had died unseen. Courage in the face of silence. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike fighter pilots or infantrymen, submariners fought without witnesses. Their triumphs were unrecorded until after the war. Their losses, when they came, were total. No survivors, no remains. Many boats simply vanished. USS Grunion, USS Greyback, USS Wahoo, USS Tang. names that would later become memorials carved into stone. When one failed to return, no search parties went out. The ocean itself became their grave, and yet they volunteered. Again and again. Historians later noted that morale among submariners remained among the highest in the U.S. military. The reason was simple: purpose. Every man knew that one successful patrol meant fuel not reaching Japan, ammunition not delivered, soldiers stranded on islands. Their actions, though invisible, were decisive. The mind of the submariner commanders of these boats carried immense responsibility. In seconds, they decided life or death for their crews. Men like Dudley "Mush" Morton, commanding the USS Wahoo, embodied this nerve. Morton preferred aggressive tactics, attacking convoys at periscope depth in broad daylight. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, absorbed everything, lessons that would make him one of the most successful submarine captains in history aboard USS Tang. There was also Eugene Fluckey, who commanded USS Barb. Fluckey led one of the boldest missions of the war, sneaking into Japanese coastal waters to fire torpedoes at anchored ships, and later sending a small team ashore to sabotage a train line in Japan itself. These men were not reckless. They were methodical, intelligent, and precise. Each attack required calm calculation: torpedo speed, target bearing, enemy course, all while evading destroyers above. When depth charges rained down, the submariners could do nothing but wait. The hull flexed, lights flickered, air pressure rose. The sound of each explosion rolled through the metal, heavy, physical, terrifying. Some prayed silently. Others smiled grimly, waiting for the next shock, and yet, when the explosions stopped and the destroyers moved on, they rose again, and silent, unseen, relentless. By 1944, the submariners had become a brotherhood forged in darkness and endurance. Their craft, once underestimated, had turned into the sharpest instrument of naval warfare, not by size, but by precision and patience. They had learned to hunt an empire, and while they honed their art beneath the waves, Japan remained unaware of just how complete the transformation had become. The Japanese blind spot, while American submariners refined the art of undersea warfare, Japan remained trapped in an outdated naval philosophy, one forged in the traditions of battleship supremacy and decisive fleet engagements. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, war at sea was an affair of honor and spectacle, mighty fleets clashing under the rising sun. Submarines, in their view, were tools to weaken an enemy before such a battle, not to strangle his economy. Even as their merchant fleet began to vanish, Tokyo's admirals refused to adjust. Convoy systems were poorly coordinated, escort vessels few, and technology lagged far behind. Japanese sonar, the Type 93 hydrophone, was primitive compared to American systems. Their destroyers lacked radar. Merchant captains often sailed alone, trusting fate and distance. The result was predictable. By late 1943, oil from the Dutch East Indies, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, was being sunk faster than it could be shipped. Tankers that once carried 2 million barrels a month were reduced to a fraction of that. And yet Japanese naval planners still prepared for a final, decisive battle, a confrontation that would never come. The real war was already being lost in silence. The strategic angle, intelligence and precision. The power of America's silent fleet did not rest solely on torpedoes. It rested on information. From the very start of the Pacific War, American cryptanalysts had been reading Japan's naval communications. Codebreakers working under Magic, and later Ultra, provided Admiral Nimitz with exact sailing dates and routes of Japanese convoys. This intelligence flowed directly to submarine commanders at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle. The coordination was remarkable. Submarines were stationed like hunters along invisible lines across the ocean, choke points near Luzon, the East China Sea, and the Java Sea. When a Japanese convoy departed Singapore, American commanders already knew its destination. One after another, ships vanished. A freighter bound for Yokohama never arrived. An oil tanker carrying fuel for carrier aircraft simply disappeared mid-route. It was warfare guided by mathematics and code breaking, in the world's first true synthesis of intelligence and precision strike. By 1944, Admiral Lockwood's staff at Pearl Harbor maintained a real-time map of Japan's maritime collapse. Dots representing merchant ships slowly disappeared from the charts. What had once been dense sea lanes became empty blue spaces. Every sinking rippled through the Japanese economy. Factories closed for lack of materials. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Civilians began to starve, and all of it, every death, every shortage, was the result of decisions made quietly, without fanfare, in the corridors of American naval intelligence. The moral dimension. The war. No one saw submarine warfare blurred the moral lines of combat. Unlike aerial bombing, there were no witnesses, no photographs, no survivors to tell their story. When a torpedo struck a freighter, there was only a brief eruption of steam and debris, then silence. Hundreds of men, sailors, and civilians alike went down with their ships in seconds. The sea swallowed them without a trace. This was total war in its purest form, anonymous, invisible, relentless. Many submariners spoke later of the psychological weight of their victories. They never saw their enemies' faces, yet they knew that every torpedo meant lives lost. Some wrestled with guilt long after the war ended. Others justified it as necessity, the only way to end a brutal conflict. Historically, submarine warfare had already crossed moral boundaries during World War I, when Germany's unrestricted attacks drew global outrage. But in the Pacific, the rules no longer held. Japan had struck first at Pearl Harbor. Now America struck back in silence. To the men of the Silent Fleet, this was justice. To the Japanese, it was annihilation from the depths, an unseen enemy against whom courage and strategy were meaningless. The Japanese awakening by 1944, Tokyo finally began to understand the scale of its crisis. The loss reports were staggering. Merchant tonnage had fallen from 6 million tons in 1941 to less than 2 million by the end of 1944. The empire's industrial heart was dying, not from bombs, but from hunger and paralysis. Japan scrambled to respond. New convoy systems were organized. Escort carriers were built, along with a handful of specialized anti-submarine ships. But it was far too late. They lacked trained crews, fuel, and, most critically, time. The Americans had already closed the noose. Submarines now patrolled within sight of Japan's coastlines. By early 1945, they were mining harbors, sinking fishing vessels, even surfacing to shell. Every night, flares from burning ships lit the horizon. Every morning, oil slicks spread for miles across the sea. The fall of the South China Sea Fleet in late 1944, Japan's last attempt to move vital oil and resources northward, ended in catastrophe. Convoy HI-81, carrying fuel from Singapore to Japan, set sail under heavy escort. It never arrived. American submarines, USS Queenfish, USS Barb, and USS Pakuta, intercepted it near Luzon. In a coordinated attack, they sank the Akitsu Maru, a transport carrying over 2,000 soldiers, along with multiple tankers. Hundreds perished. The survivors floated for days before disappearing beneath the waves. Similar disasters struck convoys HI-71 and HI-82, each one reduced to wreckage within days. By year's end, the shipping route that once fed Japan's industries had been obliterated. The empire's last oil convoys never reached home. For the first time in history, an industrial nation was being starved entirely by undersea warfare. USS Tang, triumph and tragedy, among the many submarines that wrote their legend in these months, none shone brighter, or ended more tragically, than the USS Tang commanded by Richard O'Kane. The Tang had become the deadliest submarine in U.S. history. O'Kane's boldness bordered on the impossible. He would attack convoys at point-blank range, surfacing at night between escorts to fire torpedoes from both bow and stern. His precision was unmatched. Every patrol a string of victories. But on the night of October 24, 1944, fate turned. While attacking a Japanese convoy near Formosa, Tang fired her final torpedo. It malfunctioned, curving in an arc, and came back toward her. Before anyone could react, it struck the stern. The explosion tore through the submarine. Tang sank rapidly. Of her crew of 87, only 9 survived, rescued not by the U.S. Navy but by the Japanese. O'Kane would spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. The Tang's death was a cruel twist, but her legacy was already sealed. By that moment, her patrols had destroyed over 33 enemy ships, more than any other U.S. submarine. Her story symbolized the duality of the silent service. Triumph built on the edge of annihilation. Operation Desecrate and the death of the merchant fleet. Meanwhile, in the broader Pacific, the devastation continued. Submarines no longer confined themselves to open sea lanes. They entered harbors, mined channels, and even surfaced near shorelines to bombard industrial targets. The USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, performed one of the most audacious operations of the war. In January 1945, Fluckey led his boat into Nam Quan Harbor on the Chinese coast, a narrow mined channel guarded by patrol ships. Under cover of darkness, Barb fired torpedoes into a crowded anchorage. Destroying 8 enemy vessels, then escaped at full speed as explosions lit the bay behind her. Fluckey's daring became legendary, earning him the Medal of Honor. But his most striking act came later that year. Fluckey sent a small landing party ashore in Hokkaido, the first Americans to set foot on Japanese soil during the war, to sabotage a coastal railway. They rigged explosives to a passing train, which detonated moments later, derailing it completely. It was a symbolic gesture, proof that the silent fleet had reached Japan itself. By early 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was effectively extinct. Fewer than 500,000 tons of shipping remained operational, barely 10% of what it had in 1941. The empire's factories stood idle. Cities rationed electricity. Even the Imperial Navy's battleships sat motionless, without the fuel to leave port. The Pacific, once filled with Japanese convoys, had become an empty sea of oil slicks and wreckage. The silent victory. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. In total, American submarines, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, sank over 300 Japanese vessels, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. But their true triumph was economic. They sank more than 5 million tons of merchant shipping, cutting Japan's industrial arteries until nothing flowed. By mid-1945, Japan's cities could still fight on land, but they were isolated, hungry, and powerless. The empire was already beaten long before the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet even as victory approached, the submariners did not celebrate. Their war had been fought in isolation, their comrades buried beneath the sea. 52 submarines never returned, taking more than 3,500 men with them. They had won by being unseen, and in many ways, their sacrifices remained the same. The silent fleet had achieved total dominance, and yet its victory was as invisible as the war it fought. But with Japan's oceans now empty, one question lingered. What would the world look like after such silence? The empire starved. By the beginning of 1945, Japan's empire no longer lived. It simply persisted. Factories still stood, soldiers still fought, but the lifeblood that sustained them, oil, steel, food, and ammunition, had been drained away by the silent fleet. It was not sudden, but slow and suffocating. Every month, fewer ships reached the home islands. Every convoy that left Southeast Asia carried less fuel, fewer supplies, and fewer men returned. In Tokyo, ministers spoke of temporary shortages. But within the Imperial Navy's staff offices, the truth was known. Charts once marked with shipping routes were now nearly blank. Supply officers reported fuel levels so low that training exercises had ceased entirely. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese Navy's great battleships, Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, had become floating fortresses, immobile for lack of oil. Yamato's final mission, Operation Tengo in April 1945, was a suicide run, a one-way voyage to Okinawa with barely enough fuel for the trip. She was sunk before she ever reached the shore. That moment symbolized the empire's death rattle. Japan still possessed weapons and men, but its capacity to project power was gone. The ocean, once its path to conquest, had become an unbroken expanse of defeat, the collapse of industry on. The home front, the effects of the silent fleet were everywhere. Steel production dropped by half. Aircraft assembly lines ran dry without imported aluminum or oil. Trains stood still. Cities darkened at night to conserve power. The civilian population bore the brunt of the collapse. Famine spread quietly. In 1944, rice rations were cut by 20%. By mid-1945, urban workers survived on less than 1,500 calories a day. Entire towns scavenged for bark, grass, and roots. The sea, once Japan's greatest resource, now offered little. Fishing vessels were sunk or immobilized, their fuel reserves confiscated for military use. Even the army, vast and entrenched across Asia that began to starve. Soldiers on islands like Truk, Rabaul, and the Philippines resorted to foraging and, at times, cannibalism. Their supply ships had long since disappeared beneath the waves. It was not an army defeated by battle, but by isolation. The strategic outcome for the United States. The submarine campaign had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Without the need for massive amphibious assaults or prolonged blockades, an entire industrial empire had been paralyzed. Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote, "Our submarines held the key to victory. They choked off Japan's lifelines and ended the war long before the bomb." By mid-1945, Japan's oil imports had fallen by over 95%, and more than 90% of its merchant shipping lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The economy had ceased to function. The Imperial Navy could no longer maneuver. The war, in every practical sense, was lost before the atomic bomb ever fell. Yet the silent fleet's triumph had come at a cost. Of the 288 U.S. submarines that served in the Pacific, 52 were lost. Their deaths were often unseen, their fates unknown. Each patrol that failed to return left only silence. A name crossed off the board at Pearl Harbor. A family waiting for a letter that never arrived. In the Memorial Hall at Pearl Harbor today, 52 bronze plaques bear those names: Wahoo, Tang, Grunion, Grayback, Trigger, Shark, silent witnesses to the price of victory. The Empire's realization within Japan's high command. The acknowledgement came late and quietly. After the war, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, one of the architects of the kamikaze strategy, confessed, "We lost the war because we could not protect our sea lanes." It was not a poetic statement. It was an autopsy. By the time Japan discovered the scale of America's silent fleet, the ocean was already theirs no longer. Every harbor was watched. Every route was mapped. Every ship that sailed was marked for death, and in the end, Japan's greatest vulnerability was not its courage or its weapons, but its isolation in a world where the ocean could no longer be trusted. The empire had drowned long before it surrendered. The reckoning after victory when Bahia. The war finally ended in August 1945. The Japanese surrender documents were signed aboard the battleship Missouri. Cameras flashed, flags waved. But beneath the ceremony, the true architects of Japan's defeat remained invisible. No submarines were present in Tokyo Bay that day. Their crews were scattered, some returning from patrol, others still missing beneath the Pacific. But their work had already reshaped the world. After the surrender, American intelligence officers began a meticulous survey of Japan's wartime economy. What they found astonished even the victors. Japan had lost nearly 9 million tons of shipping, over 80% of its pre-war capacity. Entire industries had ceased to exist, not because of bombing or invasion, but because raw materials had simply stopped arriving. It became clear that the silent fleet had done more than destroy ships. It had destroyed time. Every plan, every convoy, every hope for recovery. The strategic revolution, the submarine campaign of the Pacific was unlike anything seen before. In Europe, the German U-boat war had been fierce but ultimately contained. In the Pacific, the Americans achieved what Germany never could: total maritime control. Historians later described it as the most successful naval blockade in modern history. It was conducted not by surface ships or minefields, but by invisible machines, each the size of a small building, crewed by barely 80 men. The lessons were immediate and profound. Naval doctrine around the world changed overnight. Gone was the belief that wars were won solely by battleships and carriers. In their place rose a new understanding, that the sea could be controlled from below, by stealth rather than strength. The silent fleet had proven that a nation's arteries, its shipping lanes, its resource flow could be severed quietly, systematically, and with devastating precision. Even within the U.S. Navy, the war's end sparked reflection. Admirals once skeptical of submarine warfare now recognized its decisive role. Budgets shifted. Research into sonar, propulsion, and underwater endurance exploded, and soon, within a decade, nuclear submarines, descendants of the Gato and Balau classes, would emerge, capable of remaining submerged for months. The legacy of the Pacific campaign had set the course for the Cold War. Voices from the deep. For the men who survived, the end of the war was bittersweet. They returned home to parades, medals, and handshakes, but many carried memories they could not share. Their victories had come without witnesses, and their losses without graves. Commander Eugene Fluckey once wrote, "The ocean is a cruel ally. She hides our triumphs and our dead alike." At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Lockwood stood before the submarine memorial and read the roll of lost boats, 52 names, one for each week of the year. His voice broke halfway through. Each name represented 80 men who had gone down without trace, whose war would never end. In time, these men would be recognized as some of the most effective warriors of the modern age, quiet professionals who fought in darkness so others could live in light. Japan's post-war reflection. After the war, Japan rebuilt, but the lessons of its defeat stayed etched in memory. Naval officers studied the American submarine campaign in painful detail. Reports acknowledged the fatal underestimation of logistics and anti-submarine warfare. In the 1950s, Japan's new maritime self-defense force would begin building submarines of its own, not for conquest, but for vigilance. The sea that once carried dreams of empire now carried memory and humility. The numbers tell the story. By 1945, the final accounting of the Silent Fleet's war read like a ledger of inevitability. 314 enemy ships destroyed. Million tons of merchant shipping sunk, 8 aircraft carriers, a battleship, and 11 cruisers eliminated. Over 55% of Japan's total maritime losses caused by submarines alone. All this, achieved by less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. In strategic terms, it was annihilation, not through spectacle, but through silence. The submarine campaign had not merely changed the war, it had changed warfare itself. And yet amid the triumph, the ocean kept its secrets. Beneath the calm Pacific waters lay steel coffins, American and Japanese alike, resting where the sea had claimed them. The Silent Fleet had won, but at a cost measured not in ships, but in souls. The silence that changed the world. The war ended with mushroom clouds, but long before that, the ocean had already gone quiet. In that stillness lay the true turning point of the Pacific War, not in the roar of aircraft or the thunder of artillery, but in the whispered currents below the surface. It was there that the empire of Japan was undone, not by spectacle, but by silence. America's Silent Fleet revealed a truth that would define modern warfare, that power need not be loud to be absolute. Invisible weapons, guided by intelligence and endurance, could achieve what no army of millions could, the slow suffocation of an empire without ever setting foot on its shores. For the men who lived through it, the silence was eternal. They carried it home, in their dreams, in the absence of their comrades, in the unmarked graves of the deep. They had seen the price of victory measured not in banners or parades, but in the quiet disappearance of enemies they never saw. The sea had been their battlefield and their tomb. New era beneath the waves. The lessons of the Silent Fleet transcended 1945. In the decades that followed, submarines evolved from hunters of ships to custodians of peace. Their descendants would carry nuclear weapons, deterrence replacing destruction, a new form of silence, this time born not of attack, but of restraint. From the wrecks that sleep beneath the Pacific rose a paradox, that in learning to fight unseen, humanity also learned to fear the unseen, the ocean. Once the stage of conquest had become the keeper of memory. Epilogue today. The Pacific remains vast and calm. Somewhere beneath its waves lie the remains of the Wahoo, the Tang, the Shokaku, the Taiho, and countless merchantmen, silent reminders of the price of arrogance, innovation, and endurance. When Japan discovered America's Silent Fleet, it was already too late. But in that discovery, the world glimpsed the future. A future where wars would be won not by noise and spectacle, but by precision, patience, and silence. And in that silence, history found its most haunting victory.